Great, thank you very much. I have just a few clarifying questions and then some questions that I've sort of collected from early discussions from the panel for you. But first, can you just clarify for us what kind of data is being shared? Is this mostly preclinical, early phase study? Is it mostly observational data? What data is being shared?
It's a combination. Most of our data is clinical trial data and at the individual patient level, for which we also get data dictionaries and annotated case report forms. So really just about everything that a sponsor may have submitted to the FDA. For some of our consortium, the Safety Biomarker Consortium, they do a lot in the preclinical space. So the companies are sharing some of the data that they're getting on animal models. And every once in a while, we throw in some observational data that we can get from the outside. For example, when we do a clinical trial simulation model, and we just did one for Alzheimer's disease, which was qualified by the EMA and endorsed by the FDA. And for that, we needed some disease progression data, which we got from the ADNI effort, which was very helpful. But I should also point out an interesting part of that. So our Alzheimer data pool is the one that's open to qualified researchers. Now, if we were to take into that pool a trial from an Alzheimer trial that was funded by the NIH, we would no longer be able to make that pooled data available to outside qualified researchers because of some of the data sharing rules at NIH. And that's happened with more than one of our consortium and more than one institute at NIH.
And just to clarify, is it then companies or institutions within the larger critical path consortium can self-aggregate into smaller consortia that are focused on particular data sharing projects? Is that how that works?
Yes. And so, for example, we have one consortia that works primarily on Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease. So some of the companies only want to be involved in the Alzheimer's projects. Some only want to really be involved in the Parkinson's. So depending on the project, they can self-aggregate. And each database, each data set they contribute, they can dictate what access agreements they will have.
So this is a very large effort, and we're thinking in data sharing is also a very large effort. We've been thinking about, well, how do you roll out something like this? What you're going to learn as you go. What were some of sort of the strategies of rolling out a large project like this? What were some stages that you thought about? Did you pick one disease or a set of companies and try it out on a small scale? How did it grow?
I think that's a great question because we get asked to take on new projects periodically. In fact, we've just been asked through the FDA to consider taking on a neonatal consortium because of what's considered a huge unmet need in that area. And to do that, our first step is to really figure out all the players in the field so that we can get everybody on the table, at the table. I think that what FDA relies on is that we really can gather up expertise from all over the world. So we can get all the companies that are interested in that particular disease area, all the academics that have contributed to the portfolio of research on it, and then any disease societies. So that's like a very important first step of getting those folks together and let those folks figure out what are the chief priorities for their consortium.
This is a closed partnership, so you have members that are voluntarily participating, but obviously there are still risks and concerns. So we're curious whether there have been real examples of the risk coming true. Like, have there been examples of disclosure of proprietary information? Have people felt like they were harmed in some way? And do you have ways of knowing if that happened? And then also, what kind of approaches are you taking to sort of assuage members' fears of risks?
I should say that so far we haven't experienced the downside, although that area of patient confidentiality is the one that we're always really attuned to, because at the very beginning, as you know, all the HIPAA regulations and also the other country regulations have changed for patient confidentiality. And so sometimes we've gotten data sets in where we've been assured that they're de-identified, and all of a sudden when our data team looks at it, they see patient initials on it. So depending on where it's coming from Canada, from Russia, from whatever, people have different ideas of what's meant by data identification. So that's been the closest one to a scare.
I'll let the panel ask Artie.
So I had two questions. The first is I wanted to drill down a little bit on your value proposition. So you don't have any IP on the ultimate tool that comes out. That means it's licensed, or it's available to anyone who wants to use it.
Available to anybody, free.
So, and I assume that this is only partially publicly funded. The money is coming in part from the companies involved. So what's their value proposition in terms of doing all this work and then releasing the tool free of charge to anyone?
Well, I think part of it is that we really do try to set up a collaborative relationship with the FDA, and that's been very important for our member companies. Mm-hmm. We go to the FDA a couple times, even without a specific meetings to qualify our instruments. So the companies get a sense of how the FDA is viewing the research and the standards in a certain area, and also a company, as they see us work on developing and qualifying a particular biomarker, a particular clinical outcome assessment, they can use that information already in their development programs. They don't have to wait. I mean, it's a couple years before you get through a qualified drug development tool. So they can make use of that information. And at the same time, I think it really helps the FDA to have all that expertise brought to the FDA, and so they can really get a sense of the landscape for a particular disease area. Because as you know, the landscape is constantly changing, and the FDA has a struggle of how much evidence to require or weigh before they draw a cutoff and say that they can qualify a tool for a specific context of use.
And the second question is, since it's closed, obviously there may be entities that want to play that don't get to play. How many complaints have you had along those lines, and or do they not care because they'll ultimately get the tool free of charge anyway?
What we do, once a consortium is established, all the companies have one member on our coordinating committee that directs all the activities. And the members of the coordinating committee are the ones that vote on whether they want to allow a new member into the consortium. So, and the coordinating committees are not just the companies. For our MS consortium, half of our coordinating committee members are academics. So there's a balance. It's really hard because there's so many people involved in our consortium for one group to have a dominating voice.
There are other questions? Over the years, have you noticed that participating in these consortia have led to more of a comfort and a greater desire or capacity to share?
I think definitely the climate has really changed. So, I mean, we're at the point where the one database where we have open to qualified researchers, that's only the placebo arm of the data. Now, the way that all the different movements, including Jessica's company leading on data sharing, that really has changed the culture. So I really expect that some of the databases that we've collected under agreements that really restrict their use, I think they will be opened up. And I should say our data, even though we have specific research goals that we're getting that data for, getting instruments qualified with the FDA is sort of an iterative process, and we may have it qualified for one context of use, like, for example, using a biomarker to enrich patients in clinical trials for Alzheimer's, and then we'd like to progress into using it as maybe a prognostic or diagnostic or a primary endpoint in a trial. So we're going to keep on making use of those databases as we add more data to it and go for other contexts of use.
And can you address a little bit the considerations that come into play when you have international partners as well?
Actually, the hardest one for us is getting everybody through all those time zones together on our monthly and biweekly calls. But I think it really helps. I mean, especially, for example, for this neonatal consortium, I think everybody's on board in wanting to make sure that nothing is duplicated at all in between the U.S. and the EU. And the EU has a slightly different model. You've probably heard a lot about the Innovative Medicines Initiative, which actually makes funding these different consortia a little bit easier than what we have. But in any case, we reach out to our partners that are based through IMI consortia to make sure we're all on the same page.
Yeah, Joanne?
You know, clearly this is one of the longest running and also one of the most successful in terms of important publications, important new paths, and also companies and academia both participating together to get outcomes. What do you think has been the biggest driver of getting so much active engagement and participation? Is it the closed model? Is there something else? Is it because the goals are, you know, so concrete and everyone can see the shared goals? What is it about your model that you think is so enabling?
I think that you hit it when you said that the goals are so concrete, and they're driven also by goals that within each company people can see the value for them in making go or no-go decisions. So that's what's really driven it. What's been this is a new process. I mean, the final guidance for drug development tools came out last month by the FDA, and we've been working with the FDA to try to initiate and develop that process. So at the outset, there was, you know, a kind of a, what is this all about that had held back some companies. And we get the clear message that companies would rather not be involved in partnerships or consortia that are mainly talking and not action-oriented for real deliverables.
Steve?
I just want to get a little more clarity on what the use of the sharing of phase. You said they share clinical trial data. I don't know how much is that of that is phase 1 and phase 2 versus phase 3. What's the value of the phase 3 sharing within the consortium?
Most of it actually is phase 3 clinical trial data from the companies, and that's the way that we can have biomarker data
Right.
that will hold up to scrutiny by the FDA, and that also was crucial for developing the clinical trial simulation tool for Alzheimer's. It had to be phase 3 data.
I see, but the main use and motivation within the consortium is to develop these tools like the biomarkers for qualifying biomarkers, not necessarily for some of the other purposes that we've heard in terms of either reanalysis to affirm that it was right or recombining the studies to see if we can discover new things. Is that right?
Correct. We're not in the discovery space. In fact, that's what sometimes we have this discussion with our academics who get real excited about a recent publication and ready to go to the FDA with qualifying a new biomarker. It takes a lot more than a publication to have data that will pass FDA scrutiny. So we only try to go for projects where we are pretty sure that there's a lot of data out there already. And we'd rather not have to do prospective clinical trials. So we really, that's why we make sure we have all the companies at the table for a particular project that actually have data to contribute because they've been working on that.
Thank you.
So to follow up on this, one of the ethical reasons for doing data sharing has to do with adverse events. So you have developed a new entity to inhibit some biological pathway, and in your phase 3 trials, it turns out that there It's 1 in 1,000 episode of something terrible happening. And for some reason, the drug doesn't get developed. So is there sharing of those adverse event data so that if company B now wants to inhibit the same pathway, they know to look out for this adverse event specifically? Because this is one of the key ethical issues that we've talked about. People shouldn't have to put themselves at risk to have something terrible happen to them when we knew it could happen, at least before they were exposed.
Yeah, most of our consortia work on efficacy data, and the tools that are used for efficacy, demonstrating efficacy. Our one consortium that works on safety biomarkers would get into that adverse event space, but what they do is for each organ system, there's 7 different ones that they really try to identify and qualify markers that show when there's different toxic events happening after administering the drug. We don't get into the sentinel space that FDA has set up, and so we don't get into analyzing data that comes in after marketing for adverse events.
There are other questions from the committee? Maybe one last one, and then we'll turn it over to Steve for the
Just
final discussion.
A quick follow-up, but you do get data on drugs that have been abandoned, not just drugs that have been approved, but drugs that have been abandoned as well?
Yes, I mean, and there can be some very useful data in those data sets for sometimes just for biomarker data, sometimes just disease progression data. There's such a dearth of information on just disease progression that those studies can be really helpful.
We have a question from Jessica.
Thank you. Speaking on behalf of GSK, we feel that the consortium model is not an or proposition, but an and there's a lot of value in all that you're doing. The focus isn't necessarily on extending the data and making it accessible to external researchers. And so I think that in comparing and contrasting, the requirement that a sponsor be a part of the consortium, volunteer to be a part of that, and then the ability to extend the data to external researchers is a good reason why there are, pros and cons to the different models depending on the focus.
Great. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.